The lands of men, ancient forests of elves, deep caverns of dwarfs, and the seas of... who? Exactly. We've got a blind spot in fantasy, and it's obvious to see why. As humans, it turns out we're best at telling stories which involve bipedal land-based humanoids. But in my view, at least in some worlds, we might see a third ancient empire alongside the all-too-classic elves and dwarfs. Because despite our assumptions, life below the waves is far better than we like to think. Let's dive in. So for this video, I'm going to be discussing merfolk. To keep things simple, I'm going to assume that they can breathe underwater, but that being outside of water doesn't cause them immediate death. Things change slightly in a more positive direction later on if we assume true amphibiousness, but it doesn't matter that much. They are assumed to be reasonably unaffected by ocean pressure as long as they stay within the photic zone or at least the first few hundred meters of sea depth. Variants who can endure higher pressures will be discussed later. So how much space do merfolk actually have to operate? Theoretically, the top layer of ocean for the entire world, but it does rather depend on which world they inhabit. To be a settled people, it is likely that a set location is required, with perhaps physical structures or at least some concentrated agriculture. As such, our merfolk empire likely needs solid ground under their fins. If we require said ground to be in the photic zone, the first 200 meters of water where the vast majority of sunlight and photosynthesis happens, then our merfolk are limited almost exclusively to waters over a continental shelf. Atolls, seamounts, volcanic island chains, and Sargasso seas serve as very thematic exceptions to this rule, but continental shelf is the largest by far of any of these environments. However, in our world, this environment takes up 8% of undersea floor. Yet almost all kelp, seaweed, coral, and in fact almost all ground-moored plant life in general exists in this region, as light simply can't penetrate much deeper. This also means that an abundance of sea life lives here too, as this is where the vast majority of the plants are. But as we know, 70% or above of the world is covered with water. 8% of that is coastal shelf and 1% is rivers and lakes. That's a lot of coastal shelf. In fact, this one environment takes up 15% of all of our continental tectonic surfaces, just behind mountains at 21%. In other words, there is certainly room for a vast coastal empire of undersea folks. But surely living underwater is horrible. Well, early humans use shelters, both caves and built structures, to avoid bad weather and scary animals, largely. But bad weather doesn't really exist underwater. Sure, you get freak tides, tsunami, and the occasional waterspout or whirlpool, but by and large, humanoid creatures would be able to manage all of these, weather the storms pretty well, even tsunami if they can follow the tide out and notice early enough. Hail, snow, high winds, driving rain, or scorching heat mean very little, just 30 meters below the water surface, and best of all, sea temperatures remain relatively stable. But sharks and killer whales? Fair. I raise you wolves, bears, tigers, hippos, and the like, but in all seriousness, merfolks do need a way to deal with ocean predators, which are more than just sharks and orca, as well as some of the dangerous poisonous creatures and plants under the sea. Perhaps the most useful invention in this regard would be the spear, or polearm more generally. Merfolk tools likely start out using sea creature bones and teeth, and some rocks as well, so finding a haft long enough to be useful may be a matter of carving into large found whale bones. But as soon as merfolk can present a legitimate threat from some distance, deterring or at least redirecting attacks gets much easier. It's likely that an alert enough merperson can deter almost any solo predator long enough for it to give up, assuming the merfolk has stamina and skill, that is. See, merfolk could build shelters under the waves, but I don't know if they'd even need to. It's genuinely that good to live underwater as a water-breathing humanoid, as long as you can communicate ancestral teachings about which creatures are dangerous, how to deal with them, and which things are just worth staying away from. It is worth interrogating quickly exactly why our planet is so set up to provide this lovely, shallow enough habitat for merfolk. It does seem mightily convenient. Like much of the existence of life on Earth, the fact that we have coastal shallows which support all manner of wonderful sea life feels like a massive cosmic coincidence. It turns out at some points in Earth's history there were few or no continental shelves at all. The fact that this relatively shallow, relatively well-lit environment even exists at all is due in large part to ice melts since the last ice age. Before this, the continental crust ended pretty much after sloping down towards the waterline, dropping off to some grand, horrible, abyssal ocean. If your world uses tectonic continental masses, it is worth considering if this zone, this safe, shallow zone, actually exists at all. Or if at the edge of each landmass where a continental plate meets an oceanic plate, there isn't just some great, terrifying abyss just meters from shore. And so without farmable plants, these kind of shallow sea life environments, or the ability to build shelters on the ground, except for those few environments mentioned earlier, I can see merfolk in this sort of world remaining as hunter-gatherers, sustaining on phytoplankton, algae, and the odd hunted fish. However, if you don't want to bother with complex plate tectonics, which, let's be fair, many world builders don't, then your seas are likely to be much, much, much shallower than those on Earth, and much less varied in depth. Such a planet would likely need towering, gigantic volcanoes to vent planetary heat, and would experience a dramatic variety and volatility of climate across its lands. So kind of your classic dramatic, semi-tropical fantasy world then, even down to the gigantic volcanoes everywhere. If this is the case in your world, or you simply hate plate tectonics, then there is nearly no excuse for adding a merfolk empire grander than any human, dwarfen, or elfin one. Shallow seas, like those created by this sort of setup, like you're adding water to Mars for example, would have abundant corals and sea life, abundant merfolk hunting grounds, and very, very few deep-sea leviathans to worry about. It's literally the perfect breeding ground for a merfolk empire. But, tangent aside, we're going to assume limited coastal regions with no real need to build shelters to protect them, at least from weather. The trouble is, why would creatures in such a situation bother with building a civilization? More than most, hunting and gathering suits this coastal environment incredibly well. To build clothes, tie together broken spears, and build nets for fishing, kelp, seagrass, and seaweed are pretty useful, and living in or near a coral reef could prove exceedingly useful in defending or deflecting attacks from creatures. With this said, farming a kelp forest, whether you've planted it or not, just makes sense, especially as it provides shelter both for merfolk and a variety of tasty and useful creatures. Clams make incredible sense as a farmed creature. They're not great at getting away, and their shells can be incredibly useful. Finally, kelp forest style farms could be really quite efficient, not only providing excellent hunting grounds for a bunch of tasty fish, but also incredibly efficient vertical farms, which merfolk can consume the product of, as well as weave into useful items. So for defense, crafts, food, and simplicity, the first merfolk settlements would likely be around kelp or seaweed forests, likely shifting their mentality from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled hunter-gatherers, and eventually working within the structures of farming and agriculture. And this abundance of resources on offer means that even if merfolk don't seek shelter for themselves, they will likely need somewhere to store their harvests, from a place to cure or dry seaweed to storage for shells, bones, and other useful items, even storage for harvested seaweed. Caves may suffice for a time, but eventually a settled society will likely seek more convenient structures closer to their farms or hunting grounds. Originally, these structures would likely be conglomerations of natural corals and large bones, but if any civilization is likely to discover Roman-style marine concrete early, it's merfolk. Volcanic materials are easily acquired from undersea vents and undersea volcanoes, and mixing it with lime is literally the only other step in making this concrete, considering seawater, which is also a resource needed, surrounds them. The big hurdle, really, is determining that there is actually value in trying to smelt shells, another readily available resource undersea, to make lime. Thankfully, it's a massively important construction material for mixing all sorts of things in our ancient world. So as long as merfolks have connections in some kind to people who plaster, people who make bricks, or people who create mortar anywhere in their local surroundings, this most amazing of building materials in the ancient world is perfectly within their grasp. But why is this Roman marine concrete so important? Well, it turns out, specifically when exposed to seawater, it is one of the best building materials ever invented. It even repairs cracks in its own form naturally, and at least for marine uses, is strictly better than the concrete we were making 60 years ago. So once our merfolk have ventured onto the shore with the purpose of smelting shells, or, got someone else to do it for them, it's off to the races. It's likely that the first uses of this kind of concrete would be to reinforce natural or semi-natural undersea structures, like caves, and especially dead corals and these perhaps coral bone structures generally. But in time, I can imagine this concrete being spread in more ambitious structures too, likely domes with holes at the top. But this isn't the only way for undersea coastal creatures to thrive and survive. It is true that nutrient depletion and overfishing are huge threats, avoided by remaining in a nomadic hunter-gatherer style society. In my view, it's likely that before merfolk develop sustainable farming practices, they will likely experience hardships and food scarcity, likely leading to breakaway tribes, following one of two molds. Either moving in one direction across the coastal shelf, keeping to the shallows, or braving that abyssal trench. Strategy 1 would likely eventually lead to a group circling round the entire coastline of their continent or island, so may result in some doubling back eventually, but I must say the idea of a merfolk civilization meeting back up with those who abandoned it 100 years ago as they've made an entire loop around the continent seems like the sort of thing that should be in someone's world. There are also a couple of ways that these deep sea expeditions could go. Either they stay on the surface of the sea and seek out a seamount, Sargasso Sea, or another continent, hoping for a safe harbour in another direction, or they ally with some significant undersea threat. A dragon turtle, a kraken, or aboleth, or something of the sort. A whale large enough will certainly do, and serve as custodians, protectors, or hangers-on, or they find an undersea, deep-sea thermal vent. These vents teem with life, but deep down in the dark oceans, this life is largely pretty ugly and pretty parasitic in terms of its relation to scavenged food. If merfolk who brave these trenches can survive the water pressure, they would likely not need to sea living down here for a particular amount of time, and might transform into quite the fearsome scavengers around thermal vents, perhaps with the ability to make metals themselves. But back to our settlers, we have some degree of farming and domestication, and if they survive in place, a method of somewhat sustainably extracting resources from the same location over and over again. But this does not an ancient civilization make. We need to see technological advances, and that is tough without fire. I've already discussed the difficulties with making quicklime out of shells, but their deep sea neighbours by thermal vents may not actually need to worry. Unfortunately, our shallow sea merfolk are going to struggle to move beyond bone and shell tools without magic or emerging onto the surface to create fire and smelt, as they most likely did with quicklime in small smelters on the beaches. Fortunately, the absolute best advance a merfolk civilization could possibly need is bronze. Iron and steel are next to useless, and at least until stainless steel is invented, but bronze is incredibly unreactive in water. All merfolk need is a way to smelt it, and they would, in tool strength alone, likely surpass many of the limitations stopping them from literally ruling the seas. Either a friendly local civilization or shore-based stone smelters using animal blubber as fuel, and it is likely that we have a serious civilizational contender on our hands. Because merfolk have one more secret weapon. As the smartest and best equipped creatures in the seas, domestication of animals proves reasonable and likely. From seal and dolphin scouts and mounts to swordfish platoons, not to mention octopodes and crustaceans, so many useful creatures could easily be trained by simply feeding them regularly, as this cosmopolitan, concrete-dwelling society. By the time other civilizations are starting to sail the seas in earnest, merfolk will likely have enough undersea clout to seriously hamper any unsanctioned warring, trading, or sailing in general. Sea trade, considering it starts literally at the edge of any merfolk territory, would likely be controlled by such a civilization. Whether vessels need to pay tolls to the waves or make habits of seeking protections and advice for the seas from the merfolk, attempting to sail without their go-ahead would be foolish indeed. I would consider modelling merfolk society upon Bronze Age Greek and Phoenician societies, heavily multi-competent trading peoples who thrive off of their diplomatic connections. Indeed, merfolk sign language may become an international standard for seafarers. In blustery winds, driving rain, hand and arm signals seem eminently useful after all. Perhaps all of the deaf people in your world have ancient merfolk to thank for their inclusion at the table. The presence of merfolk empires on these coasts would also likely have significant impacts on maritime law and the feasibility of sea-based smuggling and imports. It's very difficult to keep smuggling or shipwrecking enterprises afloat when a group of civilized, vigilant folk patrol above and below the waves very regularly. I can easily imagine ancient merfolk chastising egotistical human upstarts seeking to master the waves, or even some rogue elements of merfolk society getting very rich indeed for knowing exactly who to wreck, where to wreck 'em, and where to hide the goods. Perhaps sirens are less mythological and monstrous than we imagine, considering all of this. So I must say, if we zoom out, much of what I've suggested today is not that novel. domed structures, undersea empires using domesticated undersea creatures. These are staples of pretty much every Atlantean fantasy. But it is that way because they work and they make sense. And please remember that merfolk designed cities would look strange. There's no doors, likely at all. No doors certainly at floor level. That's just nonsensical undersea. And in a future world where flight and magic become democratized, few have more experience in 360-degree combat situations than the merfolk. Besides, how, other than just dropping heavy things in the water, do you ever go to war with these guys before chemical warfare is an option, which would destroy the very reefs that protect your coasts from great waves? No. Barring calamities, or in D&D specifically, aboleths, merfolk are here to stay. An ancient empire on the level of elves and dwarfs, unless your world has some unusual seas indeed. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive on another fantastical race of creatures. If you are enjoying this sort of thing, please do let me know in the comments. Leave a like and share with a friend as well. Why not? And do subscribe so you can see more videos like this. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.